Good morning, everybody. We will just take a minute to let everybody in the room. I hope everybody's doing well in Washington. It's a beautiful day and it's going to be hot or hotter. So I hope where you are, you're doing well. Okay, we'll just take a few more minutes.
This
All
feels
right,
very formal.
sorry,
I was saying
Pablo?
this feels very formal with us being silent, waiting.
Hmm. Especially since we were yapping our
Yeah,
heads off for
exactly.
5 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let us get started and people will join us over time. So welcome everybody to webinar 40, I think it's 46 of the Hub's webinars, which are put on by the Hub, by the NSF NIST Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society, by various institutes at GW, the Bridge, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and others. Today's webinar, as you know, is on what is digital sovereignty. And, oh, excuse me, that's an interesting Freudian slip. Digital solidarity, because that's what I'm writing on now. So today we are really privileged to have two of the world's experts in this topic. We have Adam Segal, who is the senior advisor at the Department of State, and he is the former Ira Lipman Chair at the Council on Foreign Relations. And we have Pablo Chavez, who is Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security. He formerly worked at several major American corporations working on the cloud. And Pablo now writes on a wide number of topics, including AI sovereignty and digital sovereignty. And so we are lucky to hear from these experts, and I will let them begin. Today's webinar, each speaker will speak for 10 minutes. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and we're eager to hear them. Adam?
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for having me today, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to talk very briefly about the making of the strategy, the three big arguments we see in it, just introduce the four areas of action. I won't get into detail, talk about the responses so far, and then talk a little bit about implementation, and then hopefully do all that in 10 minutes and pass it on to Pablo. So as Susan mentioned, before joining the Bureau 14 months ago, I was at Council on Foreign Relations. This is my first government rodeo, my first time inside the US government, which had its good points and its bad points, I guess, from as an outsider perspective on building a strategy. Essentially, I engaged in when I first arrived, in a set of kind of snowballing interviews within the Bureau and then inside the department, because cyber and digital issues are still spread along other departments in the State Department, not just in CDP and the Cyber and Digital Bureau. Then asked all of those people I spoke to who they dealt with in the interagency. So then, went across to Commerce and DoD and DHS and all the others to talk about what their priorities were, and made a trip in October to Singapore for Singapore Cyber Week and did some early socialization with ASEAN and some European countries. Came back and did a draft and did outreach in DC in December and January to think tanks and some academics and civil society. Produced another draft, did some table reads, and then we started the interagency in March. And it all came together first week in May. You may have seen Secretary Blinken gave a speech at RSA, the first time that a sitting secretary has given a speech at RSA. which is, I think, a real signal about the importance of these issues to U.S. foreign policy right now. In the very geeky world that we all exist in, you could tell it was a big win because Politico said the State Department dominated the first day of RSA, probably a sentence that had never been written before, but we really showed DHS and DoD on that first day. So a really positive rollout of that and promotion of it. The strategy, I think, does three big things. The first one is the promoting an affirmative vision of what we want to accomplish in this space. And so, of course, the strategy talks a lot about what our adversaries are doing in this space and the threats from APT actors and rise of digital authoritarianism and all of the bad things. But I think really we have a sense that the positive arguments go a lot farther, especially among the Global South and G77 countries, about how they can use technology to achieve their goals and how we really want to be the partner of choice. The positive vision broadly is framed in this idea of digital solidarity. So here, a big shout out to Pablo, who first introduced the term. We kind of ran with it and expanded it broader to his original use around the cloud, but we really took many of the ideas and broadened it to a whole set of issues that the U.S. wanted to be promoting this idea of digital solidarity. Now, digital solidarity is both an outcome and a process, so it's in some cases a little tautological, but I think we really see three main threads to it. The first is aligning interests around data governance and digital governance among rights respecting countries, right? So really we want to try to make sure that we find approaches that respect domestic needs, but also promote and preserve an open as internet as possible. Second is the mutual support that we provide to countries that are suffering from digital harms, in particular malicious cyber attacks. And so that can be everything from providing threat intelligence, but also building the coalitions around joint attribution and calling out bad actors. And then third is digital and cyber capacity building. So helping partners achieve their development and sustainable development goals. So those two kind of moves are then fleshed out through what we're calling a kind of a digital ecosystem or tech stack approach. And here, really contrasting to earlier strategies, and in particular the 2011 White House international strategy, which was focused on a narrower set of internet technologies, that the Bureau and the department are really focused on everything from, subsea cables to data centers to cloud providers, LEOs and satellite communications, but also this emerging set of technologies or AI and quantum in particular. So those are the three big moves. They get fleshed out in 4 areas of action and countless lines of effort. I'll just go through the 4 areas of action quickly. The first one is promote, build, and maintain an open, inclusive, secure, and resilient digital ecosystem. So that is a lot of the focus on the tech stack that I was talking about. So 5G and subsea cables and the others. Second is align rights-respecting approaches to digital and data governance with international partners. So, again, how do we encourage the trusted flow of data? How do we talk about the ad hoc cybercrime treaty, promoting other digital rights? 3 is advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace and countering threats to cyberspace and critical infrastructure by building coalitions and engaging partners. So as we try to move from the OEWG and the GGE and the UN to the POA to the Program of Action to more implementation-oriented, action-oriented areas around the norms, joint attribution, getting other countries to sign the joint declaration on misuse of commercial spyware, And then finally, strengthen and build international partner digital and cyber capacity. And here a big focus is on the CDT, the Cyber and Digital Related Technologies Fund, which is $50 million that's been given to the Bureau to specifically respond to digital and cyber issues. Responses so far have generally been positive. I think people like the idea of digital solidarity. They just want more details about how we're actually going to implement it. But I would say, especially in ASEAN and among most of the EU countries, that would be generally positive. There has been a response, mostly that I've seen in the US, that this is a tech alliance, a T12 or a D12. We're pushing back against that idea that, yes, we are talking about working with countries that want to develop, deploy, use, govern technologies in a rights-respecting manner, but we're not really thinking about this as a means testing to who we're going to work with. We are cognizant that, given the range of issues, that sometimes we're not, making decisions about how democratic or how open a country is when we want to address some issues. And the Secretary uses this terms about kind of fit for purposes of groupings or alliances, and I think that is how we are also thinking about it. And then third, you will not be surprised to hear that a French diplomat approached me and said that, we were beating up on the wrong type of sovereignty, that we should beat up on the digital sovereignty that Russia and China are promoting, but not the digital sovereignty that France or other European countries are promoting. And I think here there's some extent that is true, and the strategy reflects that, in that we acknowledge that there are legitimate pursuits of protecting citizens' rights and national security that countries are going to promote their interests. But again, I think we're falling back on the aligning of those approaches, that we want to make sure that those approaches to sovereignty are as broad as possible, and again, kind of maintain as open internet as possible. All right, let me conclude really quickly on implementation. We are now developing the framework for implementation. That's what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks before I leave the department. I'm not sure how public that will be, but you can get some sense of what we're working on and how we're thinking about it from the conclusion of the strategy, where we talk about some mileposts. So about how we're making progress. One of them is the POA, principles around AI, so internationalizing the voluntary principles, Hiroshima, Bletchley Park, and then there's some things around cables and data. So those are some areas that we'll probably be giving some more details to how we're going to implement them. So I'll stop there and pass it on to Pablo now.
That was great. Susan, is there anything you'd like to say before I get started?
No, I'm looking forward to hearing
All
your
right.
remarks. Thank
Excellent.
you.
And thank you for hosting the webinar. It's really great to be here with you. In particular, given so much work that you've done on digital trade and other issues that are relevant to today's conversation. And it is wonderful to be here with Adam, who's done an amazing job, along with obviously colleagues at state and beyond, of writing what, I mean, if you look through the strategy, it is really kind of very, very broad ranging and very, very deep. And really kind of in many ways a historic effort to address the geopolitical challenges and opportunities that we're facing in today's digital ecosystem. So Adam's overview of the strategy and kind of the background was terrific, and I learned a lot from it. I'll focus my remarks on kind of a little bit of an outside point of view of why the strategy is so important. Again, from a little bit of an observer's perspective, some of the big opportunities for the strategy, and also finally some of the potential issues that need to be addressed for the strategy to reach its potential. So starting with the first question, why is this cyberspace and digital policy strategy so important? I think that to answer the question, you really need to look at the policy debate that the State Department's strategy is entering and hopefully significantly influencing. When you think back, for decades now, we've managed an international digital policy spectrum of open versus closed. And on one pole of the spectrum has been kind of the US, which is basically promoted the idea of a free and open internet, in one form or another, and that's basically been the foreign digital policy of the United States for the last quarter century. This policy of what's sometimes called internet freedom basically represents the idea that the global digital space should be open to commerce and free expression. And over time, U.S. policy on the global digital ecosystem has become more robust. So, for example, today, essentially, the policy of the U.S. government is to promote an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure digital ecosystem that promotes human rights, including free expression, supports economic prosperity, and protects privacy, and also guards against harms like harassment and abuse. On the other end of the spectrum is something that's called, Adam was alluding to this, called cyber sovereignty or internet sovereignty or digital sovereignty. And so this is basically the idea that governments, that they can and should establish barriers between their domestic digital environments and the outside world, and essentially promote internet governance models that are designed to create closed and restricted digital ecosystems. So, on the pole, kind of on the end of that spectrum, the hard form of digital sovereignty would be kind of a country like China, that's kind of represents the opposite of what I talked about in terms of, a free and open internet, because it has, it's basically taken the idea of digital sovereignty and used it to censor the internet, surveil citizens, prohibit or at least significantly restrict the free flow of cross-border data, sometimes freeze out or severely limit foreign tech firms to build up domestic national champions, and a bunch of other things. So those are kind of like the two poles of the spectrum. Now, with some exceptions, most open, rule-bound, democratic countries tended to be on the open side of the spectrum. However, around in the 2010s, countries like France, Adam mentioned France before, started to look hard at implementing their own versions of digital sovereignty. And this is because they saw how digital technology shapes in kind of really fundamental ways, politics, the economy, military issues, societal trends and outcomes. I mean, it's very, technology impacts holistically. And therefore, they argued that essentially controlling such technology is really critical to defending and promoting the national interest. So we saw this trend accelerate during, kind of, I guess, really the 1-2 punch of COVID and, growing US-China competition, or again, around kind of 2020. And that really made lots of countries rethink their dependence on foreign digital products, on foreign digital, services, and think about kind of forging their own path. So, Susan mentioned before kind of sovereign AI as well. So this trend among open democratic societies is increasing with generative AI. And we're seeing really the emergence of, kind of an offshoot or maybe a subset of digital sovereignty called sovereign AI, which is basically kind of like about a nation's development and control of its own, AI models, infrastructure, and data. And essentially, it's kind of an industrial policy that drives towards, technological self-reliance. So kind of coming back to the State Department strategy, I kind of think of, again, as an observer and an analyst, I think about it as really representing two things. First, it's a direct response to digital sovereignty that offers an alternative vision, a positive vision of the global digital ecosystem. In a way, it's kind of about building digital bridges rather than walls. Second, it's in many ways a mechanism for meeting countries. We mentioned France before, but meeting some of these countries, especially democratic countries that want more control over their digital environments, kind of meeting them where they are, and really kind of addressing the concerns that Adam mentioned before. It's kind of a way of acknowledging that they have interests in more control over their technology, and in a way to offer partnership in developing and managing technology, and hopefully in that process encouraging more openness, cooperation, mutual benefit, and so forth. So I think Adam alluded to this also, but I think it's important, again, from an outsider's perspective, to mention that the strategy doesn't seem to throw away the U.S. government's openness agenda by, in any way, shape, or form. Rather, it kind of focuses more on achieving freedom and openness through digital solidarity, rather than kind of simply advocating for an outcome without a path to getting there. And I think of the digital solidarity plan as kind of like the path towards this end state that the U.S. government has advocated for. So what are some of the opportunities for the strategy? So first of all, it's important to note that this is not a theoretical strategy. In a way, the State Department is just really kind of giving more shape and direction and depth to efforts that have already been underway. So for example, the US government has been involved in building subsea cables with allies and partners. And there's a couple of examples of the US government stepping up to help countries secure their digital infrastructure against things like ransomware attacks and other types of cyber attacks. But looking forward, I think that there's a lot of initiatives that flow out of the strategy that give us, I guess the way to put it is that it kind of gives us a sense of kind of like what the future holds for the strategy. I'll mention two. The first, I think, is kind of the ongoing establishment of an International AI Safety Alliance. One of the most interesting things, and I think ultimately impactful developments on the AI front, is the launch of AI safety institutes by the US and its allies and partners. So these institutes focus on things like testing advanced models and systems to assess risks and things like that. Last month, 10 countries like Australia, Canada, France, Japan, Singapore, the US, and also the EU, they agreed to form an international network of these institutes to advance AI safety science. And I think that's a great example of digital solidarity and also critical for the global governance of AI and the promotion of AI safety. The second opportunity that I'll mention very briefly is essentially kind of the build together agenda that is set forth by the strategy that Adam and his team wrote. Basically, the strategy focuses a lot on the idea of building digital infrastructure with partners and allies around the world to kind of create a trusted digital ecosystem that's reliable and open and secure. And so we're starting to see some of these projects come online. So for example, we've seen examples of European telecom companies and US cloud providers working together to provide cloud computing services to developing countries. There's also obviously efforts to establish partnerships around 5G to get trusted providers to build 5G networks around the world. And again, this build together agenda is kind of a great example of digital solidarity in action. So lastly, just things to kind of watch out for to kind of assess the, perhaps the success of the strategy. At a high level, I think that for any strategy to be successful, you really kind of need to ensure that it's ultimately put into action and that it survives kind of, first contact with the world as it is. And so with that in mind, I've just been kind of like looking at it and thinking about things to watch out for. So first, staffing, budget, training, the strategy in so many ways is a paradigm shift in how the US government conducts, diplomacy and foreign relations. And so that's going to require staffing, budgets, training, and even perhaps kind of further adjustments to the structure of our foreign policy efforts to ensure, kind of coordination and effectiveness of these strategies. Second, I think it's going to be really important to make sure that there's ongoing alignment within the US government. The strategy really represents the US government as a whole, and officials from Commerce, DHS, and other agencies worked with state, as Adam mentioned, to develop it and have advocated for it since its release. But there are some signs that there isn't full alignment within the government. So for example, USTR's withdrawal of its support for the free flow of information and other related matters and trade agreements is an example of this. And so I think that we should be looking for signs of further and stronger alignment behind the strategy to judge its success. The last thing, and then I'll stop talking, I apologize, I had a lot to say about this. I will be looking for how the State Department defines, tracks, and communicates its digital solidarity wins. So much happens in the digital space that I'll personally be curious to see if, kind of which projects are categorized as digital solidarity projects, what criteria are used for those projects, how they're communicated, how they're tracked, so that we can see in a few months and, in the years to come, how successful the strategy has been. And so obviously there's a lot more to talk about. And I look forward to the conversation with Susan, Adam, and others. And Susan, thanks again for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Let me just say to you, Pablo, your work has been inspiring, frankly, not just to me, but obviously to the Department of State. And so thank you both very much. I want to reiterate, please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll read them in a minute or two. Let me ask a question, which is, from 1997, when the US government first, in the Clinton administration, first put forward the framework for global e-commerce, or the global framework for e-commerce, one of the two, talked about the importance of trust and how that stems from an inclusive approach to governance, right? Although the way that manifested through the Internet Governance Forum on cybersecurity was multi-stakeholderism. And that, I think, from the years that I've been working on these issues, which I would say is 2014, so 10 years, I see trust declining. And if you look at polling data, trust in US leadership of the global digital economy, of AI, et cetera. So how can the United States build trust when its own strategy, as Pablo pointed out, is a little disjointed among agencies? And it seems unclear where we're going. Adam, I apologize for putting you on the spot, but you are leaving. And who is going to lead this in a way that builds trust?
Well, I mean, Ambassador Fick is still around, and he leads the bureau. I think, look, yes, I'm not going to try and say there are not tensions in the U.S. government, but that is true across a whole range of policy issues. And you'll see there is language about, the trusted flow of data there that made it through the interagency. So that meant everybody signed off on it, and that is kind of a public view of that there. I'll say, Susan, I think you're putting your finger on a point that the strategy made and probably wanted to make stronger, which is that domestic leadership, coherence, policy making are incredibly important for us in this space to lead foreign policy wise. I'm not sure there is another space where you can point to, domestic regulations or what we're being able to do around AI and social media, all those other things have such a large impact on our ability to lead on the foreign policy sector. So the strategy is, cognizant of that, and the national cyber strategy from the ONCD, the National Cyber Director's Office talks about the need for a national privacy law, which we echo that the need for it. But I would say, on the positive side, these digital and cyber issues are pretty bipartisan. We do have pretty broad support. The fund that I mentioned, the cyber and digital technology related fund, made it through Congress. Our budget, has been pretty steady on these issues. Representative Mike McCall, when we released the strategy, released a public statement that was pretty positive and, made some of the points that Pablo made about that the proof will be in the implementation, which is a fair point to make. So I think you're right. We certainly have some domestic issues, but I would also say, they're not as bad as they probably are in some other spaces.
But what about engendering trust internationally? And, is the United States credible these days?
I think, look, on these issues, a lot of it is going to be the follow through, right? It's one thing to say solidarity, and it's another to follow through on it. I think our messaging on the digital and cyber issues has been pretty good. But and I think, to be also honest, there has been a change in mindset about before we were against a lot of things, and now we are really trying to be for, or at least proactive against the things we are against, right? So I think you can see the change, for example, in engaging the ITU and around, supporting during Boynton and Martin and her agenda there, before, very much the US's response that was, basically trying to keep the ITU at arm's length or telling it what it should or shouldn't do in that space. I think you see that around the use of the UN and the, the AI resolution that the US helped push forward with, the other 180 whatever co-sponsors were on that bill. So I think we are trying to build that trust through actually showing up and providing.
Thank you so much. Pablo, do you want to add anything here?
No, I think that what Adam says makes a ton of sense. I do. I mean, your comment, Susan, resonates, and certainly, this issue of trust is one that pops up, all the time. It's kind of, the trust and consistency, which reminds me of kind of like one definition of trust, which is, trust is consistency over time. And so, again, a lot of this is going to hinge on implementation and kind of doing it in a strong and consistent way. I will say though that one of the challenges in the trust debate is that we kind of look at kind of the tech world and tech policy as kind of like this just ball of stuff, right? And so, but if you start to kind of like if you start to divide it up into kind of more discrete categories, you really start to see that the U.S. Does have and has had like a really significant leadership role in a bunch of areas. So what I mean by that is, you can kind of kind of like divide it as follows. So building, regulating and aligning. And so, in terms of building, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity for the U.S. government to work in partnership with other, partners and allies, as well as with the private sector to basically further distribute what is, kind of best of class technology, demonstrably so, for the entire world, including the developing world, the global south, as some people call it, and so forth. So I think that is a great opportunity. I think the second thing, I mentioned the AI safety institutes. That's all about kind of like aligning, the science and kind of like the understanding of what, the consequences of AI are going to be. And so that is an area of leadership where, the United States has been a leader, has nothing to be ashamed of, because really consistently from the Obama administration to the current administration, it's been very focused on that layer of governance of AI. And so I think that there's a really good story to tell on that. Regulation, I think, is where it gets like a little bit dicier, and and they're essentially kind of like the talking point is, how does the U.S. government, how can the U.S. government go and engage internationally when it doesn't have a comprehensive privacy law? So first of all, obviously we should have a comprehensive privacy law, but I would also just simply say that there's a lot of kind of governance and capacity that the United States has in the digital governance space that can be shared as kind of best practices. And so I think that kind of putting forward what is a humble, but at the same time kind of like confident and experienced point internationally on digital policy is important. And again, I just think that if we kind of segment these things out, and if we're clear and concise about what we're talking about, and we act consistently over time, I think that will go a long way to addressing the trust issues that you're talking about, which are not fictitious, right? They're definitely out there.
And so to begin with the question, here's an example of misunderstanding that's led to a real decline in trust. So X asks, how has the strategy's promotion of digital trade been received by other countries at a time when USTR has turned away from data flows and market access? Let me just correct one thing. USTR did not say it would not support the free flow of data. It withdrew its support for certain non-papers at the WTO. It never said it doesn't support the free flow of data. So just to be clear with that question, you guys, sorry to lecture there.
You are a professor. So.
That doesn't excuse lecturing.
Okay. So I'd say the response has been basically raising the point that Susan did, which is that they are also aware of the tension in the U.S. government, and so wanting to know how that is manifesting. But again, I think the strategy is very clear that the U.S. is still promoting that idea. It is just, as Susan said, made some changes within the frame of those specific discussions. So yeah, I don't have much more to say. I think the response has been, are we still promoting it? We are saying yes, and there is now a kind of government-wide kind of response to that.
Pablo, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, look, I like I feel that sense of inconsistency. Obviously I mentioned it in my comments, but I also, kind of going back to the point about, kind of being, sharper and more precise about kind of what what we're talking about. I don't know as a reader of the strategy that the strategy is, simply about kind of, opening up the world to kind of free and open commerce and communication, et cetera. I think that it is a strategy that recognizes that not every country is on the same page. And so, I think that it's quite important, for us to kind of take that reality into account and perhaps see a strategy like the one that Adam and his team drafted as one of kind of concentric circles, right? Where, there is a core group of countries and stakeholders that do share, interests in terms of digital exchange, openness, kind of, building trusted infrastructure together. And so that I think it seems to me that there wouldn't be any debate about, should there be free flow of information, et cetera, within that kind of that circle of, of partners and allies. I think kind of beyond that is, essentially kind of like the countries that would benefit from capacity building, from the build out of digital infrastructure and so forth. And perhaps that's kind of a little bit of a different category of country that would be kind of benefiting from from the partnerships of of the first circle. And then I think the third circle is countries like China, where there is less alignment and where perhaps there will be less free flow of information and so forth. By the way, by their choice as well. And but even there, I think that the strategy contemplates that there's a number of issues that even for countries that are embracing digital sovereignty versus solidarity, that there is room to work together with them. And so again, I just think that this is not kind of black and or white, binary. There's kind of these shades of gray throughout, and I just think it's important for us, as observers, for you as a scholar, to really kind of think through those as as we're moving forward on this digital strategy.
Thank you for that clarification. It's really helpful. To the person who asked the next question, I'd really like to ask it, but it's very confusing. So if you could reframe it, the one about national security communities, that would be helpful, and then we can ask it. A colleague from Diplo has a question. What does digital solidarity mean for the Americas, especially to Latin America? And she also wants to know, what kind of concrete projects and assistance can a developing country expect to participate in?
So I don't think there's there's not a specific regional breakdown of, I think the set of issues are somewhat similar. I think, the ambassador has been speaking about Costa Rica as the kind of ideal example of what digital solidarity in action would look like. Because it covers a whole range of the issues that we want to talk about. So, first is the response to the ransomware attack, right? And coming to Costa Rica's assistance and helping with incident response and building out the CERT and now doing workforce training. And so a whole range of capacity building and incident responses there. Then there's a second kind of after effect from that, which is Costa Rica began to think about trusted suppliers and secure connectivity inside of Costa Rica, and began playing a larger role in regional discussions about how we can make sure that countries are building their infrastructure with those trusted suppliers. And then third is Intel and other countries beginning to think about investment in Costa Rica because for secure supply chain issues, but because now this kind of change internally and this broad government focus on secure infrastructure. And so that is a great example of what we would hope to accomplish in other cases. Now that's 3-for-1 in some cases. It's not sure we're gonna be able to recreate that, but that's certainly the type of thing that we're looking for. And I think regionally we are looking for we are hoping to help countries pursue connectivity goals and ensure their resilience and cybersecurity as we help build out. But I think it's really going to depend on country-specific needs and our capabilities.
Pablo, you want to add anything?
No, I totally agree with Adam. I think that that's a really, really good summary. I think the only thing that I would add is that, you can't see the State Department's strategy without taking into account, the fact that at the same time, Commerce and others are putting, fairly significant restrictions on advanced technology. By the way, there's a fire truck, and my dog howls when she hears fire truck. So I apologize if you hear anything. But I think that these are kind of like the two speeds, right? The two sides of of the overall U.S. effort on digital policy. And so when I think about kind of digital solidarity in the Americas, I do very much think about, we are focusing on, as Adam mentioned, supply chains. We're focused on kind of, where are chips going to be manufactured, where are data centers going to be located, where are subsea cables going to be built. And there, I think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in the Americas. It's already been, explored in Chile, Mexico, Colombia, and in other countries. I think the last thing I would say about this too is that that this is, the strategy does not exist in a vacuum, right? In some ways, as I mentioned before, the strategy is a response to digital sovereignty efforts, and in some ways, more specifically, to kind of efforts by China to build out its own, digital infrastructure throughout the world. So it has the digital Silk Road. We have, I think, now something much better than that, something like Digital Silk Road plus with democratic characteristics. And and throughout Latin America, what we're seeing is Huawei, for example, building out data centers, other technical infrastructure. I think it's really important as a result of this strategy to demonstrate that the U.S. government, that allies, partners, and trust infrastructure providers are also going to be building in those same countries, offering options and competing against kind of like less trusted, more closed systems. So I personally think that Latin America is very exciting for this strategy, and hopefully more is done by the State Department there.
Let me just add that USAID's digital policy strategy is coming out within the next weeks or months. And so that will have a lot of specific programs that USAID will be doing around democracy support and development and sustainability goals. CISA has a international engagement plan, I think they're calling it. So there's been a lot of work with the Americas around critical infrastructure protection. So a lot of these things are going to be spread around different agencies and focused on the Americas.
But the bottom line is just, you're leaving, Nathan Fick will still be here, but there will be advocates for actual projects and funding beyond the AI safety institutes, beyond.
Yeah, Susan, you're truly overstating the importance of my leaving. I was brought in only to write the strategy.
Okay.
And so, everyone who does all the implementation, besides Ambassador Fick, Steve Lang, who's the ambassador for international communication policy, Liesl Franz, who's the DAS for cybersecurity. Everybody else is still staying around. And I think, to address one of the rightful issues that Pablo raised about, difficulties of follow-up is that, on staffing budget. So staffing wise, we continue to grow, not as quickly as we would like to, but across the department, by the end of this year, we should have a cyber or digital officer in every embassy across the country. We should have almost 240 people across the world, sorry. Should have almost 240 people trained overall. And budget, as I mentioned, $50 million for the fund isn't huge compared to the money behind the digital Silk Road. But the ambassador has framed it, and we are thinking about it as that it's a test grant, and we're going to deliver on it and hopefully get more. So I think those things are all moving forward, no matter where I am.
Thank you so much. Okay. what global vehicles or institutions could be used to promote solidarity?
So it's happening across a range of things. So, for example, it's happening in the UN and the Global Digital Compact. I saw some language of us inserting digital solidarity into one of the drafts. I don't know where we are on that, but so it's happening there, and it's certainly happening in a range of the multilateral, bilateral discussions the U.S. is engaged in. So the TTC and the U.S.-EU cyber dialogue and um, the ASEAN dialogue. And so essentially, now I just see it being used in almost all of our comments. And press release that just came out from the U.S.-Spain cyber dialogue mentions digital solidarity. So I suspect we'll just see the language being used quite frequently in the public announcements. Pablo is exactly right. It's just going to decide the implementation and what the metric for what represents a kind of manifestation of that, as opposed to just saying it, is going to be extremely important.
Pablo, do you want to add anything?
No, I totally agree with what Adam said.
Okie dokie. What improvements in U.S. national regulation of data privacy, and this will be your own opinion, not CNAS's or the Department of State, would help convince others to cooperate on digital solidarity? Pablo, you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I mean, again, to me, this is one of these things where you really need to kind of like define what category of kind of digital solidarity you're talking about, right? So if it's a matter of of working together with European partners, for example, to build out 5G networks in Africa, I don't think that requires like a lot of convincing. I think that is, just really a matter of kind of like bringing the parties together, ensuring that, the relevant governments are supportive, perhaps providing a little bit of capital to just, kind of demonstrate additional support, and so forth. So I think that build category, I'm not sure that is, is deeply, problematic. There is also kind of, a tremendous amount of effort around, aligning with respect to standards and so forth, and AI and a bunch of other digital categories. There again, I think that there's a lot of, seeing eye to eye between the U.S. government and other governments on those issues. I think where it gets, like all this gets a little bit tougher is, when for example, the European Union says, well, we have our, EU AI Act, or we have our GDPR, and, the US doesn't have, specific equivalents. And to me, like that is kind of a matter of, cabining off those issues, and also really kind of having an understanding that, different democracies move at different speeds for different reasons. With respect to AI, for example, if you look at the history of AI governance and regulation in the United States, as I mentioned before, I mean, this has been happening since the Obama administration, went through every administration until the current one, where pretty much every National Defense Authorization Act has had a very significant component on AI governance. But it's been about kind of educating government officials, funding government officials, providing kind of education around AI, providing infrastructure around AI, developing kind of ethical standards for government use, including military use of AI. So those were kind of the priorities of the United States government, which I think ended up being a little bit different from the priorities of the European Union, which obviously, given kind of its competencies and so forth, is focused more on, kind of the protection of the single market and consumer protection, and and so forth. And so I think that like having these dialogues where, hey, like we're kind of aiming basically towards the same place, but we take, somewhat different paths. I think that's important to trust building, and also to kind of mutual understanding on these issues.
Adam?
Yeah, so just stressing again that I'm speaking in my own private capacity, but I think you can see where the administration thinks it's important. If you just look at the op-ed that President Biden did in the Wall Street Journal however many years ago, where he basically says, a national privacy law, accountability and transparency around platforms. And then, trust and security again around kind of protection of children and online things. I think those are three areas where if the US made some progress on domestic side would have a big impact on the discussions in other spaces. I think Pablo's exactly right that lots of spaces we're already showing huge amount of leadership, but I think on those three, those would go a long way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it really is kind of like the content moderation layer, right? Where there's just so much, conflict and disagreement and criticism, and honestly, rightfully so in many instances. To me, I think that one of the really positive things about the strategy is that and it tells you like at the beginning, right? This is the full spectrum strategy. It's full stack. And so, so digital policy isn't just about kind of, what, like what is the content moderation policy of X or whatever, right? It is, also about kind of like building out technical infrastructure, kind of like going up the stack all the way, to the top, dealing with kind of like new technologies like AI and quantum computing. So, I hear definitely the concern, and I agree with a lot of the concern. I just hope that we don't get stuck on this particular component of digital policymaking, to the peril, at the peril of like not cooperating on a bunch of other issues that are really important.
Well, let me press you on that, just if I may, because I would argue my own work on generative AI and Thomas's work on web scraping, it looks to many countries like the this so much reminds me of Big Pharma, because during the Uruguay round, because the United States has the lead in terms of generative AI, which is built on web scraping, which essentially looks to many people like you're stealing our personal data, our opinions on sites like Reddit or, Facebook or whatever, and our intellectual property. And, it's another form of US dominance over the world, which the US has yet to answer for.
I see that Adam is staying on mute, so I'll try to respond. So I agree. I don't think that there's any I don't think that there's any debate about kind of this issue of access to data to train models, kind of licensing agreements, other business arrangements, and then also kind of like what about kind of individual rights, to their own data when it's used to train models. To me, though, I actually think that it kind of goes back a little bit to the strategy. So, I mentioned before briefly, AI sovereignty. So you're seeing a lot of countries kind of start to think about, how do they kind of participate in, in the training of generative AI models, in kind of making sure that, these efforts are, in their kind of strategic interest and also in the interest of their, of their citizens. And to me, one of the reasons why I bring up AI sovereignty is because I think that like it is another opportunity for the U.S. government to kind of bring into play the notion of solidarity, because there is I think a great opportunity. We were talking about, for example, like about Latin America before. There's an opportunity to leverage data in a safe, secure, privacy sensitive manner that generates value for countries, but that can be done in partnership both with private sector actors and government actors, in a way that I think kind of levels the playing field a little bit more. And you're already seeing kind of examples of this. So, for example, Singapore has launched its own large language model actually for the entirety of Southeast Asia, representing kind of the 11 major languages of Southeast Asia. And again, it's just kind of this idea of, this is not, it's not a one-player game. It's not really even a two-player game between the US and China. It's actually multiple players, that can participate in the development of this technology. And I, for one, would encourage the US government to really kind of be a proactive player in inserting, digital solidarity into these discussions.
I'll just add that, Pablo made the earlier excellent point is that it's not that the US system doesn't come up with ideas or decisions on these kind of questions. It just, we do it in a different way than other systems do, and it often through the courts, which means it's going to be slow, right? So given that the New York Times and others are suing the OpenAI and others for, scraping the web for their data, I think the issue is not that we're not going to have a position on it. It's just a question of when do we get it, and will it be in enough time?
So interesting. Thank you for that answer. So they want to know what this means for countries building sui generis DPI programs such as open source payment systems or data exchange systems. Anyone want to take that on?
I think DPI is a great example of a space where the department used to basically try not to engage in it, and now is trying to engage at the more proactively. I think all I can say is, and the strategy talks about, several processes trying to define what DPI is, essentially tends to be IDs, payment systems, and data systems. The discussions about the India stack and who's going to provide those services, and some of those issues, the US is not as supportive of, but I think it's one that, in the old days, we just would have stayed away from, and now we are trying to really engage with and shape from the beginning, and talk about how, rights respecting technology, cybersecurity, all these things have to be built in to the beginning. So I think it's something that they could expect that the US would engage with, I think, pretty comprehensively and hopefully constructively, and not before, which would have been a kind of a uncommitted opposition to.
Okay. So on a different area, one of our participants says, does the United States now see pathways to constructive discussions on digital sovereignty? Does the executive order on data put the US in a constrained position in such discussions? Adam, do you want to take that first? The more recent one on data brokers, which was limited to 4 terrorist countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think our argument would be somewhat almost exactly that, Susan, which is that we can engage in those discussions. One, both the process that the executive order engaged in, so transparent and soliciting feedback from the private sector, but also, as you said, extremely narrow, a defined set of the data with 4 or 5, however many adversarial countries. I don't think there's much argument to be made that we should be giving health data to adversarial countries. And I think, as Pablo said, it's really important to kind of break this down into concentric circles about openness and autonomy, or dependence, reliance, however you want to frame it. And this seems to me to be a fairly easy one where the US could engage with and talk about why we think this is legitimate and other types are not.
Pablo, do you want to comment?
No, I totally agree with Adam, but but I'll say, I mean, it's a tough task, right? Because living in the world of nuance is not as easy as living in the world of black and white. And so, when somebody kind of brings up the idea of, hey, well, what about an executive order that limits data flows to countries that are have essentially kind of perhaps threats to the United States, and isn't that a violation of digital solidarity? I think that that tells me that there is probably more work to be done on defining solidarity, to being clear about kind of what will constitute that. Again, I tend to think about this in terms of kind of concentric circles, but I do think that it would be good to have a mental model for scholars and other observers that look at this and kind of scratch their heads when they look at an example that would seem to violate the principle of of solidarity. This one, to me, doesn't. And it's, you know, it's a fairly, you know, kind of straightforward effort to kind of like keep data from flowing into, you know, the hands of entities that could be threats to the United States. But I acknowledge that there are closer calls that do need to be discussed and understood and explained.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for today's webinar. I also, if I may, want to say that thanks to Thomas Druitt, we have the 4th iteration of the mapping of 68 countries in the EU's governance of data, which I think is on our website already and will be released to the press next week. The United States is about doesn't fulfill many of our indicators, and so while we don't want this to be a beauty contest, does relatively poorly on the governance of data, institutional change, etc., although it seems to be doing more on AI. And so if you'd like to see that, please go to the Hub's website. And this will be our last webinar until September. But if you have any ideas for webinars or topics you'd like us to discuss, please email me. And we are really grateful for your participation. And thank you so much, Adam and Pablo, for your insights. And we hope you have a great summer. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thanks
Have
once
a
again
great
for having
day,
us.
everybody.
See you, Adam.
This will be
Congratulations.
on our
Thanks.
YouTube channel soon. Thank you for coming, everyone. Bye.